Anzar. He has a PhD in neuroscience and is developing technology to improve measurements of health. And he is Director of Digital Solutions at Cambridge Cognition, which is a public company in London. In Cambridge, actually, I should say. And he received his doctorate in neuroscience from Emory University. Welcome, Anzar. And if I've left anything out from your biography or your resume, please correct me. But very much interested in hearing your talk.
Thanks very much, Mark. Let me just quickly share my screen. Brilliant. Thanks, Mark, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for joining the talk. Like Mark said, my name's Anzar. I'm a neuroscientist by training, and I'm a Director of Digital Solutions here at Cambridge Cognition. I'm actually pretty excited to talk to you guys this morning about digital measurement of health, and particularly in mental health and brain health of neurological, neuropsychiatric illnesses. So just kind of a quick agenda on how we're spending the next 20, 30 minutes. I actually want to take a few minutes to introduce the measurement problem that exists in mental health. And we'll spend a good chunk of time talking about the landscape of tools in that are trying to solve that measurement problem in mental health. And we'll try to categorize them and talk about sort of fairly broadly their aims and their goals. Each tool has its own challenges, but I want to talk through some common obstacles that a lot of these tools for digital phenotyping or digital measurements or digital biomarkers, excuse me if I use those terms interchangeably, to make those tools work. And then I want to talk a little bit about how we as developers of these kinds of digital phenotyping tools can sort of at times best position ourselves to build something that is useful for patients, easy for sites, helpful for sponsors. Oh, hold up, my screen just go away. And how we can make those tools work for everybody. And then I want to actually try and bring it all together to give a quick little case study on how our team here at Cambridge Cognition is working pretty diligently to try and sort of achieve that future. As far as digital measurement and health goes. Also, please, I see that there's a chat feature. I can't see it since I'm sharing my screen right now, but please do leave your questions in there and I'll get to it at the end so that we can sort of have a nice discussion as well. Okay, so the measurement problem in mental health is a fairly well recognized and well understood one. And it's a consequence of the tools that we currently rely on as primary, secondary endpoints in clinical research are fairly well known to have some challenges or drawbacks and are less than ideal at times in helping us assess the efficacy of a novel compound that we're trying to evaluate. And this includes some practical challenges like the measurements just by their nature lend to being fairly infrequent because they're difficult to administer sometimes more frequently. And so we end up having fairly small windows over the course of the clinical trial where we can actually assess the patient's health and functioning just because they're coming into the clinic maybe once a month or maybe even less frequently than that. It's fairly well known that if we're requiring simultaneous participation by both patients and clinicians, given how little time the clinical staff has and how many patients they're usually seeing, it's often the patient's life that's going to have to be scheduled around the clinical assessment rather than the other way around. In addition to the practical logistical challenges, there's just some sort of clinical challenges associated with a lot of these assessments as well. If they're going to be reliant on some level of subjective observation, we're going to be introducing noise into the data. A lot of the scales, they're grounded in sort of outdated nosology of how we sort of understand these neurological disorders today. They were developed many, many decades ago and consequently can be somewhat insensitive to change, particularly for individual symptomatology, because the diseases are often so heterogeneous in their manifestations, and the scales are often designed to give us one number to try and measure all of depression or all of Parkinson's disease. And So they can sometimes be insensitive to change. And by ecologically invalid, it's very important to think about if it's clinic visit day, the patient's probably waking up at a different time in the morning. Maybe they have to take time off work, drive to the clinic, or take public transit. They're in an unfamiliar environment with people that they don't know very well. And if that's the window in which we're measuring patient health and functioning, it may not be reflective of their day-to-day behavior and health. So, all of these, I think, certainly preaching to the choir, but what we need are objective and sensitive and scalable measurement tools for mental health. And that's actually where a lot of these digital measurement tools come in. Now, there's a lot of different tools, and we'll go over some of them, but they're all kind of grounded in this common understanding, which is that neurological and neuropsychiatric disorders manifest themselves in some sort of observable behavior in the patient. And that observable behavior can be measured through these tools. And there's a plethora of tools that exist, whether it's from wearables to measuring keystroke activity, or using sensors, or most commonly phones or tablets, and even sort of more quote unquote traditional devices like MRI scanners or doing genetic sequencing, et cetera. There are actually some really good papers out there now that are trying to sort of wrangle all of these different devices and categorize them in certain ways. I actually really like to categorize them into 4 different buckets pretty loosely that are categorized according to the manner in which data is being collected. And I value that perspective just because it's a bit more focused on the patient's interaction or experience with these technologies. But let's just do a quick little overview of some of the kinds of tools that exist. So we're sometimes looking at just passive monitoring devices. Passive monitoring meaning there's no sort of active time or place set out for the patient to engage in the devices. Their data is just being monitored sort of continuously in the background. And this will include things like a smartwatch or keystroke activity or some kind of like sleep monitor or things like that, we use the data from to assess patient health and functioning. There's active assessments, actually what we're much closer to doing here at Cambridge Cognition, in which the patient's sort of setting down a time and a place and engaging with the technology, and the behavior that's captured during that engagement, such as a task on a smartphone or cognitive assessment, we're actively measuring patient behavior and health during those times. Self-report, whether it's ePro or any other kind of EMA, often get left out as like cutting edge digital phenotyping tools. But the truth is they're very important measurement tools because it's the one time we're getting the patient's perspective. And, there's a lot of different ways to measure the efficacy of a drug. But if the patient's reporting not feeling better, that's an important thing to know. So self-report is another way we measure patient health and behavior using technology. And then, of course, these sort of biological measures such as neuroimaging or genetic sequencing or going through electronic medical records. All of these are sort of digital ways in which we are collecting data on patient health and behavior and using it to quantify some clinically meaningful variables to assess drug response. So so there's a lot of different kinds of tools here, and what they're really trying to do is aiming to solve the measurement problem in mental health that we had just introduced in the previous slide by providing objective and sensitive and scalable measurement tools so that we can assess patient health and behavior. And they are now starting to play a much bigger role, not just in the lab and in research settings, but within clinical research and clinical trials to try and evaluate drug response. A purpose of this conference and why we're all getting together this week, we all recognize there's increased interest in sort of hybrid or virtual clinical trials. And to execute those successfully, there's reliance on sort of technology to facilitate a lot of the clinical trial activities. The spending in virtual trials is increasing. The number of trials that use devices is increasing. And of course, the last year and a half has had a big impact on the speed at which some of those tools are being adopted. But it's important to realize that this is even though there's a lot of talk and a lot of interest in using digital tools, I think a paper that was sent to me recently showed that it's actually probably less than 10%, I think around 5% of studies that are actually using some kind of technology to measure patient health and drug response at home, using some kind of tech or the other. So I think that means though there's a lot of interest, there's still a lot of room for us to think about how we can deploy this technology in studies. And there's reason to think through what has been the challenge or what are the obstacles that have stopped more and more studies to utilize these tools in their designs. So each kind of tool will have its own challenges, but they have some common obstacles that they all share. The first is this question of validation, which is probably the question that I've received most often sort of while developing these kinds of tools. But, what's the meaning of validation? There's not one person or one answer to that question. And depending on who we go to, there's often like different sort of bars that are set for what validation means. Does it mean some kind of like regulatory recognition that makes people more comfortable using them as endpoints or even exploratory secondary endpoints? Do people rely on some kind of internally generated evidence? If so, then what level of evidence is sufficient? Do we require some kind of historic support in the literature that's independently validated? It's always a little confusing as to what the bar is. It often varies study by study or perspective by perspective or sponsor by sponsor. The question of regulation sort of deserves a question of its own. At what point can a novel measurement actually be used as an endpoint? And in the FDA's own perspective, they're not yet well positioned to regulate some emerging technologies, particularly ones that are based in machine learning or AI. There just isn't that much of a precedent for using those in clinical research. The question of application is very important too, because unlike other parts of the tech ecosystem, the healthcare ecosystem is already established in its reliance on certain tech, and we can't really just replace it all. We have to think about how we fit into the existing processes of clinical care and clinical research. And at times, the people developing those tools may not consider that and develop things that have to work in a way that introduces into logistical or just practical challenges in study execution, can add to patient burden. So we have to think a lot about how we best design these tools to work within the healthcare ecosystem, but also to work with each other, which is kind of what we're going to talk about a lot in the next few minutes. There's adoption of these actually, let me use this. These tools where we're going from being fully centralized to kind of moving a little bit towards this place. But, we also want to think about sometimes if we have to be a lot more decentralized, like we were talking about last presentation, we have to think about how all these platforms work practically and logistically in the study. And right now, if there is a study that's using digital measurement tools over here, they're often going to go to several vendors to take advantage of different tools and services. And that can really at times inundate sites and patients with additional processes, which makes it, instead of trying to make the trial easier for everybody by making it hybrid or decentralized, we're actually introducing so many tools and technologies that are independent of each other that actually can create a lot of burden on its own. So how do we make digital phenotyping and digital measurement work for everyone in these kinds of scenarios? The one thing that I really want to focus on, which deals with the application challenge quite a bit, is interoperability. It is no longer really a nice to have. I think that for people like us who are developing these tools, we have to think about how we work well with other technologies that may be deployed in a study. So what do I mean by interoperability? There's front-end interoperability in which we're actively integrating different front-end components, front-end being what the patient sees and what the site sees. Because if there's several platforms being deployed in a study, let's say there's an ePro platform and a cognitive assessment platform and some kind of wearable device, the patient and site, they're going to have to enroll in 3 different platforms. They're going to have to put in different, sort of the same information 3 different times. And then when it's time for an assessment, they're getting 3 different notifications from 3 different places. And it's not a very it's a user experience that's good within each vendor or within each experience of the measurement tool. But when you have all of them going on within a study, it can get somewhat overwhelming for patients and sites to take care of that. And there's solutions to that problem for sure in front-end interoperability that we can talk about. As far as the back end goes, all of the data, once it's collected, is going to different places in the cloud. The good thing is, a lot of the technologies are being built on AWS or Google Cloud Platform, all of which allow for sort of data to be integrated with in a common place before it's shared with a sponsor. We have to think about how we can best, and this part isn't actually just patient-centric, it's actually really site and sponsor-centric of how do we sort of best manage all the different kinds of data that are coming into studies sort of back end, and how we could put that together intelligently and evaluate it. These problems, importantly, are not new. Within tech in general, there's been a lot of work through APIs and SDKs that are tools that allow for us to do these things very efficiently. Not to mention collaboration between development teams at different firms, thinking about how something like a vendor subcontracting would work, and that's important for a second. I'll bring it up in a few minutes. But the title of the talk mentions promises of digital measurement, and so I wanted to paint a little bit of a picture of what that could look like. Is if we have a sort of data collection within clinical research or healthcare in general going on, and let's say we're using an Apple Watch hooked up to a smartphone to measure actigraphy. We have some kind of smart connected medical device that syncs with either this phone or this device and has its own cloud platform where it's storing that data. And then the patient's using Cambridge Cognition to measure cognition within the clinic, and that's connected to our cloud platform. We have to think about how we can merge those data sets, this can be done sort of much more intentionally than how it is right now, where we're just kind of like all 3 of these different vendors are going to send different CSV files. Not to mention they're separated from the more traditional measurements that are happening within the clinic. So there's opportunity for interoperability both down here and up here that we should be thinking about when we're developing our tools. One thing this allows for that is actually not within the scope of the talk today, but I would love to chat with anybody about this if I'll have my emails at the end of the presentation. But this allows for sort of unprecedented level machine learning based measurement of health, which could lead to some really sort of objective and sensitive and scalable measurements. But we can save that conversation for another time. So having gone through sort of the kinds of tools that exist, some of the challenges and they face, and how we can best position ourselves to address those challenges, I want to use our tech here at Cambridge Cognition as a bit of a case study on how practically that looks like or tangibly that looks like. So because we're one vendor in clinical research, and that we're providing an end-to-end solution for measurement of cognition. The nice thing is we've got sort of all these different platforms to do it, whether it's within the clinic or we're using an iPad to take cognitive assessments for sort of thorough assessment of cognition, whether it's more frequent smartphone-based assessments that are happening at home or sort of at the patient's sort of own sort of schedule, or if it's voice-based cognitive assessments that are being delivered over smartphone, where just the voice of the patient is being used through automated assessments. There's a lot of different tools that we're providing to measure cognition, but we're doing that within the context of a service, in that we're providing the cognitive assessment, but we can also provide scientific expertise. There's ECOA, whether it's ePro or ClinRO or observer reported outcomes, not to mention we're bundling in study data management. So that's, we'll get contracted as a vendor to do these things, but it's naive for us to think that there aren't other technologies that are probably going to be used in a lot of the studies that we are deploying in. And so right now, a sponsor would have to contract with us for these things. They have to separately contract with another vendor to do something else. And if we think about interoperability, we have to allow for these kinds of scenarios where a sponsor can use our platform and then through us depend on some other kind of tool. And it's on us to try and this vendor to try and make these tools interoperable. But it's very easy to say we want to be the platform that integrates other tools. But really, if this mindset is going to be successful, then we also have to be open to not just integrating other tools into our platform, but also building our tools in that way that they're able to be integrated into another platform. So if a sponsor is contracting with somebody else for a study that's doing adverse event reporting or informed consent, and even have maybe overlap with some of our functionalities, that they should be able to set the study up in a way where they can rely on us for our cognitive assessment and scientific expertise, not to mention tethering these devices to a smartphone rather than provisioning several ones. And if we're thinking about interoperability and building our technology in intelligent or intentional ways to think about the experience of the patients and the sites and the sponsors, we should be allowing for these kinds of scenarios more and more. So just to conclude, a quick recap, there's a measurement problem in mental health. It's well recognized. Digital measurement tools are purporting to solve that problem by providing objective and scalable tools to measure health within clinical research. There are some common challenges that all these tools face. And there are things that we can do right now while we're developing these tools to make them work a little bit better for patients and sites and sponsors. And then we talked about a case study from within Cambridge Cognition and how our team here is thinking about solving those problems. So here's my email. Please shoot me an email if you're not able to ask a question today, and we'd love to chat. But let me actually quickly stop sharing the screen so that we can get to...
Well, thank you very much, Anzar. So I can only see one question, which I guess you can probably see as well, from Jen Moore, which is, how do you assess non-verbal responses?
I think this is perhaps in a question that is on Neurovocalics, our platform for voice-based assessments. Jen, please let me know if I'm interpreting that correctly. I think the nice thing about voice-based assessments is there's just so many additional levels of data, layers of data that are captured compared to sort of a screen-based assessment, in that you're not only getting the content to speech, but through natural language processing and transcription of what the patient's saying, but you're also getting how they're saying those things, so the acoustic properties of voice that are at times really indicative of neuropsychiatric functioning. By nonverbal, I think you're meaning visual or facial expressivity kinds of characteristics. To assess that, you're going to need not just voice data, but also video data. And there's a lot of work on doing that remotely. In fact, one of the tools that I used to work on did exactly that. We're assessing facial expressivity through remotely captured data and movement activity. So there definitely is precedent for that, Jen. We can assess nonverbal responses within the field of digital phenotyping in general. I think the tool that I was talking about is specifically using voice as a way to assess cognition through an automated sort of cognitive assessment interview that happens on some kind of device.
Thank you. Sam, have I missed any other questions in any chat boxes or anything there that I've missed?
I think, so far from Jen. And if anybody has any other questions, we can connect you with Anzar and his team via email as well. So again, I do want to thank you, Anzar.
Yes, I just got one question, and then we can break for coffee, just to keep things going for a little bit longer, because I know you sort of started a little bit late, so a little leeway and maybe cut into the coffee break. In terms of, I remember in the good old days or the bad old days, you used to have neurologists and psychiatrists and psychologists, and they never really spoke to each other. In fact, they often were in different religions at the time. Mm. I mean, how do you see sort of cognitive data integrating with sort of imaging data, MRI, and that sort of thing? And do you see that as an easy problem, a difficult problem, or an impossible problem?
I wouldn't call it an impossible problem, but certainly it's a difficult problem. The good thing is a lot of the record keeping getting digitized gives us an opportunity to think about how we can, in a scalable way, merge those kinds of insights. In that everybody's using Epic or Cerner or whatever it is. As far as cognitive data goes, you're right in that it's isolated from other aspects of the patient's health, but there's opportunity to use APIs to integrate those data sets. In fact, it's happening now where as long as, and that common environments are coming up where different vendors and tools can all push their data too. So let's actually leave the context of clinical research. If I'm using an Apple Watch to measure my workouts or a run or something, I can integrate that with HealthKit within Apple. And that actually integrates with my chart at the Mount Sinai healthcare system. So it actually is something that was collected digitally using the tool that now my physician will have access to within Epic. I mean, this is a very recent thing that actually was just being introduced by Apple and Epic this year. Similarly, as a lot of these tools become more widely accepted and used, we can build integrations, automatic integrations that work seamlessly and without a lot of additional burden to clinicians that allow for some kind of data that was collected digitally, like through cognitive assessments provided by Cambridge Cognition, that end up within the EMR system of the doctor. We have to think about that because it's unreasonable to expect a physician that's going to have somewhere between 7 and 15 minutes per patient to click out of Epic or Cerner and go to the other dashboard to see how the patient did on these assessments. That's not really a realistic solution. I mean, it happens at times in clinical sites because they're getting paid to do this, and depending on but then how many dashboards are going to have to go to if it's X amount of vendors for the study. So it's definitely possible to solve this problem. But like I said, we have to think about these solutions when we're developing the tech to allow for it. Because if we're just kind of very tunnel vision, only developing our tool, not thinking about how they interact with other platforms, then we're at a disadvantage in sort of in every level of the clinical research design.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you. That's great. So I guess we have a break now, and obviously, if you've got more questions for Anzar, I think he gave you his email, so feel free to email away.